This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Welcome to the show. In this episode, I've got a lovely guest on, an old friend of mine named Dave. And today we're going to be talking about the early rituals of the Western esoteric tradition. Specifically, we're going to be talking a lot about the Grimoire tradition period and Renaissance magic and how that, laid the foundation for modern occultism. I wanted to explore, how this has built into the modern world, how this developed the lineage, because we say these words like Western esotericism a lot. When you look up occultism, that like Wikipedia page for Western esotericism comes up, but we very rarely map back what that means. So we're going to be mapping that. I sort of started this project on the Platonism episode, but we're going to go deep into the Grimoires, and the Grimoires are some of the flashiest occult books out there. I mean, everyone's familiar with the Goetia. I feel like it comes up all the time. And we're going to move through that, and then we're going to talk about how to do this stuff in the modern world. How has the style of ritual and magic done shifted, right? How did we get there? And we're going to talk about what modern Western occultists can learn from the older traditions and how that, how that old knowledge can shape our lives. And then we're going to give a little bit of advice. So let's break into it. But before we do that, I am Georgina Rose. I am the host. I am the namesake, the postmodern iconoclast. I guess a little over the top, but I will take the drama. I'm a thelemite. I'm an occultist, and I'm a commentator of sorts. And Dave, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dave. I am the Amateur Magus, which is a little bit more, it's either more or less over the top. I don't know. I am a ceremonial magician who does mostly Golden Dawn style stuff, lots of Grimoire stuff. I've dabbled in a lot of the Grimoire tradition, as it's commonly called, with a little bit of Thelema, because I do post-Crowley Golden Dawn stuff. So kind of a little bit of overlap. I do a little bit of everything ceremonial.
I think that's the way to do it. I find that there's this like weird tendency in modern occultism to like really box people in. Like, since I talk a lot about Crowley, a lot about Thelema, people are like, oh, that's all she does. And then when I talk about other things, people are like, how can you be this and this? And in reality, I think these boxes are really more malleable than people think. And also, I refuse to believe someone's an internet occultist if they don't have some sort of dramatic title. I think that it works. My favorite thing ever is when someone's username is like Frater, and then there's like this really dramatic title, and it turns out their name is like Steve. It's my favorite form of humor. But let's just start off with the basic stuff. We hear the term Grimoire tradition a lot. What exactly does that like refer to? Because I feel like it's a term that people are like, yes, Grimoire tradition equal old magic book. But beyond that, people don't really define what that means, and it kind of gets thrown around a lot. So how would you like really kind of define that, if it can be cleanly defined?
So the Grimoire tradition, to me, is basically all of the old school occult books that you would have gotten from like the Renaissance and early pre-Renaissance, the medieval to Renaissance era, really. Because that's when we kind of started writing down the books, and we started writing down what the experiments were, and that's kind of when we, this is where people would take their insanely expensive, honestly, magical techniques, put them into a book, and then they would transmit the books. This is where you get people like Trithemius with his drawing spirits into crystal method, who is a teacher, I believe, of Agrippa, who everyone knows Agrippa's 3 books, and I'm going to throw the Agrippa books in the Grimoire tradition because they're kind of old-timey enough, if that's the phrase. They're old enough to where they're kind of central and they kind of give you a background in them. But most of the Grimoires that people will read are the things that inspired, say, Samuel MacGregor Mathers, Westcott, the formation of the Golden Dawn. I think that the 3 grimoires that most people are going to know off the top of their head, even if they don't know what the material's from, definitely going to be Greater and Lesser Key of Solomon, also known as the Goetia, because everyone forgets everything past the Goetia section.
There is actually only the Goetia and the Keys of Solomon. I know it says there's Lesser and Greater, implying there's multiple. No, it's just Goetia. All
Just Goetia. I've looked at that book multiple times, and I will say that even if there wasn't the Goetia section, or the Goetia section is the only parts of value in that entire book.
Well,
And
I know your thoughts on one of the sections.
oh, I hate the Ars Almadel so much, which I think we the problem with the grimoire tradition right off the bat is
Ooh,
that
let's get the hot takes. Let's throw them out.
a lot of the grimoire tradition is a complete mess because a lot of the grimoires are old translations of Latin texts, and then in the case of the Ars Almadel from the Lesser Key of Solomon, that is like originally an Arabic text that gets translated like 14 times or something. Probably exaggerating, but not by much. And then what we have nowadays is a reconstruction of a reconstruction of a copy that is probably in a complete mess of a book. So,
Well, that's what we see all the time. Whenever there's sort of new grimoire tradition stuff, which on its face, that sentence is very funny. It's almost always that someone's made some new translation. Like I remember recently, someone made a new translation of the Ebermelin. There was like a whole new book that just like fell out of the sky into that translation. Everyone was like, "Oh, all right then."
and the thing about it is, a lot of the old school grimoirists, what they would do is they would write what their version was. So, a long time ago, there was the, I believe, Mathers released the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, right?
Yes.
And then there was another version which became the Den Abramelin, and it turns out that they were similar, but they're different rituals. They're very different. They have enough noticeable differences to where you can tell that they're drawing off the same source, but they're not the same.
Well, I remember I actually did a video about the Abramelin and I used the Mathers version for my video because that's the one that I had been exposed to. And I think this was right when the Den version got translated. And a lot of people got kind of irritated about it because they're like, why are you citing the outdated version? And I tried to explain, well, the reason why I went with the Mathers is because when you look at older occultist writing, when people reference the Abramelin, they are referencing the Mathers version. And so I tried to explain this, but people were like, no, it's not the same. And so then I actually sat down and I tried to look at the Den version. I was like, okay, how is it so different, right? Did I really miss the mark? And I was reading through it and I was like, this is pretty different actually. And so I was like, huh. I still stand by making it about the Mathers version because I feel like the Mathers version, since it's been around longer, has had more impact on people, if that makes any sense.
Right.
But yeah.
It's one of those things of the Mathers version existed in modern times for longer, but the Den version is more correct, I guess. The thing about it is, both of them work. We know that the Mathers version works because that's what people were using for a long time. And we know that the Den works because people have done the Den, right?
Well, there's also another big quirk to the grimoire tradition that I kind of want to throw out there that I didn't realize immediately, and I feel kind of stupid that I didn't realize immediately, is that a lot of these books are attributed to people who probably didn't write them. Like Agrippa, the writer of the beloved Lawnmower Manual of Occultism, I will not call the 3 books of occult philosophy anything else. It is a lawnmower manual. It was revolutionary. It's important. So much is based off it, but it does read like a lawnmower manual. No shade to Agrippa. Agrippa was cool. Long dead, but just pointing that out. But there was a 4th book of occult philosophy that gets attributed to Agrippa that it's pretty clear Agrippa didn't write it. And so you see this again and again with some of these old grimoires. Like, did Solomon actually write the Keys of Solomon? I mean, that's pretty debatable. So that's another thing that I want to like kind of remind people of because nowadays when people write occult books, it's really easy to know who wrote it, right? Unless it's one of those like weird books that claim they're written by like people using very obviously fake names and with no face attached. But in general, we can immediately cite things. Whereas back then, like a lot of books got attributed to people who probably didn't write them. And so you have this like weird situation where certain authors definitely wrote some things, but not other things attributed to them. And it gets kind of messy.
It gets messy, and it's pseudonyms of like more famous occultists or people from history were very common. It's fairly obvious if you read the Lesser Keys that Solomon probably didn't write them, but he probably did some things similarly. And the other issue is people in medieval times would just rewrite a book, publish it under the same name. So it's entirely possible that both the Mathers version and the Den version of the Abramelin, just to use an example, were both two different books that were just going under the exact same name in different places in the world.
Oh, I think that's completely possible. And so we've talked about Agrippa, Abramelin. These are two of the big ones, Keys of Solomon. And I think one thing we need to recognize with this stuff is that Grimtrad, I've heard that little acronym, shortened version. I don't know what the term, not an acronym, definitely just a shortened version used around. And the thing is, I think we need to talk a little bit about how this stuff sort of laid the groundwork for modern occultism, because what I've seen here and there is people who are really into contemporary occultism, they get into it and they're like, okay, why do I need to care, right? Why do these older occult books matter when I'm jacking off onto sigils or, doing my lemon hexes, right? What does this matter? And so I want to talk a little bit about, okay, how did this stuff lay that foundation so that we have what we have today? Because they really did. Particularly, I think Agrippa is a very obvious example because many of the techniques within those books and the explanations directly lead to modern occult ideas, right? Like the philosophy part of Agrippa, I think, is incredibly important because a lot of modern occult discussions and text don't have any philosophy to them. They're basically just instruction, which some of these older books are just instruction as well. And so the good thing about Agrippa is Agrippa explains why you do the things, which is something that I think a lot of occultists lack. And so they end up lacking an understanding because they lack that why. And I think these older texts really great lay down that foundation for the why part of it.
The reason why you go through the grimoires is because most of them are actually just raw, here's how to do this thing. There's not really any philosophy to it, because the philosophy was, a lot of it was just assumed that you would be a, quote, good, wholesome Christian priest. There's a section in the Greater Key of Solomon where the exorcist is supposed to confess their sins. The exception, or the expectation, is that you are a priest or at least someone who is incredibly godly in the medieval Christian way.
Which is obviously not happening today. So, of course, there is Agrippa, which has that sort of why, but these other texts, they do lack that, with some having a little bit of it. I know Arbital gives a little bit of a why and an explanation to it, with the first half of the Arbital, not even half, it's a little less than half, where it's just kind of like things to believe, things to understand. But yeah, the average person doing the grimoire stuff is not who it used to be. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation because when you look at the average occultist now, they're not what the average occultist once was. Our knowledge base are really different, our life experiences are really different. And I think that's going to color our experiences really radically. Because one complaint that I've seen is, okay, I'm an occultist. Why are all these grimoires so Christian? And to that, I respond with, because that was the theology that was understood at the time, and there is a rich tradition of magic in those religions.
Right, and honestly, the most pagan grimoire is actually Agrippa, because he actually references he references certain things being attributed to like Venus and Dionysus and all that. But for the most part, it's all just they were Christians and all of their magic was Christian based because there was this thing called the Pope and the Inquisition at that time. So they did need to be a little bit careful and make sure that everything was Christian. But they didn't really think that was a problem because most of their prayers are just to God. There's very few grimoires from the grimoire tradition that are actually just not, you know, objectively like we're summoning angels or we're calling on God. I think the one that I can think of off the top of my head is the Book of Oberon, which is more fairy magic, which even then was kind of a gray area back in the medieval times.
Oh, yeah. I've shown some of these grimoires to my boyfriend who is Catholic. And one of my favorite games is to have him like read a little bit of it and ask him how much he could theoretically do. And a lot of the time he's like, I can do most of it. There's just like what I've noticed is I've shown him a lot of stuff. He'll say, I can do this and this, but there'll be like one prayer here and there that he's like, this is iffy. But a lot of the time it's not even really forbidden in what he does. It's just like certain things he's like, I don't know about that one. And so what's interesting is these modern grimoires, since they are the foundation of Western occultism, have been built into later traditions like the Golden Dawn and Thelema. And so even though they were Christian, they have provided the foundations for a lot of modern like pagan magic, funnily enough, because if you didn't know this, everything's actually syncretic and influenced each other. And so, even if you're a very pagan person, there's still value in looking at this stuff because more than likely, a lot of the magic you're doing is kind of pulling from these down the game of telephone.
Well, that's kind of how we got Kabbalah, isn't it? I mean, it's just syncretism stew
Oh,
after a
yeah.
certain point.
And a discussion about Kabbalah that I've been hearing a lot recently is that Kabbalah is only Judaism or like only existing in Judaism. And that's just like blatantly historically wrong, right? Kabbalah, of course, originated in Judaism, though, let's be real, not all Jewish people agree with Kabbalah or even see it as Judaism. I've seen
No.
one rabbi called it basically a heresy because it's essentially polytheism. But Kabbalah inspired so much religion outside of Judaism. Like, let's look at the Greek magical papyri, one of the few, and I would call it, I think it counts as a grimoire, that syncretized Hellenistic stuff, that syncretized Kabbalah, that syncretized all sorts of things together into this like syncretism stew because the mystics talked to each other. They wanted to discover truth, and so they were interacting and engaging. And so out of that became Christian Kabbalah and then Hermetic Kabbalah and modern anything. Every modern Western occultism has Kabbalah in it because it is sort of the blood of the tradition. It's omnipresent and exists everywhere. And so to say Kabbalah is, belonging to one simple thing is just wrong because Kabbalah is a key example and factor of our little syncretism stew.
Right. And it's important to realize that Judaism is not a monolith. Not every Jewish person is going to agree. So there's a wonderful quote from a rabbi I heard. The Jews have one God, the Christians have three, and the Kabbalists have 10. Which really sums up that rabbi's particular thoughts on it.
Oh, yeah.
But
It's not uniform. And so whenever people have this like weird black and white discussion, like Kabbalah is only Judaism, all Jews believe Kabbalah, I'm just like, you don't know what you're talking about. Immediately, I'm going to throw your opinion out.
no. And thinking that every group believes one particular thing is generally going to be kind of wrong. It's not going to be true most of the time from what I've gathered and from what I've experienced. Because even in our little syncretism stew, you can call something Kabbalah or Kabbalah or Kabbalah. The letters. I mean, that's why we started putting the letters and changing what the letters mean, because there's basically 3 different versions of Kabbalah. Only 2 of them are used, because Jewish Kabbalah and Hermetic Kabbalah look nothing alike. I've talked to a lot of Jewish Kabbalists. There's a lot that is not in Jewish Kabbalah that is in Hermetic Kabbalah, and vice versa.
Oh, absolutely. The thing that I want to bring up that I don't really discuss a lot. So I use the 3 different spellings for simplicity's sake. For those who don't know, people use K Kabbalah to refer to the Jewish system, well, the Jewish systems, because there are multiple Jewish Kabbalists. C to refer to the Christian one, and Q to refer to the Hermetic one. But that distinction is really just for linguistic simplicity. There's no like translation reason for that. That's just for like modern conversation. And if you're talking to an older occultist, like I was talking with this like boomer thelemite who like was confused why I spell things differently. He's like, why are you using different spellings? I'm like, oh, so I don't have to clarify. Like it just makes it a little simpler. So that's actually not like a textual based thing. That's just something people started doing to make all of our lives a little easier to understand that things are different. And the hard truth about religion, especially in the West, is that everything is syncretic because there's no separation of these ideas because people have always, people within traditions think about things and they make connections. And so inherently things are going to cross over. And as religion has evolved, as these traditions have evolved, obviously they've changed. And so everything's a little syncretic. I don't think there's a single, maybe there's like one tradition ever that has existed in complete isolation. I've yet to find out what it is. I don't know if that's even possible.
I think the closest thing might be the Arum Solus, because they're an
Okay.
unbroken tradition.
That might be it.
That
Yeah.
might be the only one. But
Yeah.
everything else gets syncretized with other stuff, and you get your Platonism in your Kabbalah and your paganism into your Christianity, and they end up mixing at some point. And I mean, really, that's not a bad thing. Like,
No.
without syncretism, we wouldn't have the PGM, and everyone, barring a few very bizarre spells, generally likes the PGM.
Oh yeah. Whoever the PGM author was, I think he is solidly based. I'm a fan. I actually have done a little bit of work with the PGM, and it's some of the most powerful stuff I've ever worked with. It's really incredible. And you know what's interesting? Even some stuff from the PGM has been adapted further. Like there's a ritual in there called the Headless Rite, which has become
Yep.
later the Bornless Rite, and a few other variations on it, like Samak. Like these rituals have continued to evolve, and I think that's a really beautiful thing because in the end, I think what all mystics are, looking for is truth, right? I think that's our goal. I think the goal of mysticism, of all these things, is we're trying to understand God, we're trying to understand life, we're trying to understand nature, we're trying to make sense of this crazy, chaotic world through, spirituality, being alone with the divine, and looking deeper into it. So I think it makes sense that we've all syncretized because I think all mystics were very different in countless ways, but we are all trying to find truth and to better our lives. So I think it makes sense that syncretism happens, and I think it's a good thing because if you are someone who wants to discover truth, who wants to become enlightened, who wants to become a better person, and you see someone around you doing it successfully, of course you're going to want to know what they have to say. I think that's only natural. And I think cultural exchange is a truly beautiful thing and is not something bad or something taboo. I think we should encourage it, and let's do more syncretism. I am a radical syncretist. I think we should syncretize everything. Let's just make Liber 777 more extreme. Go further. But the next thing I wanted to talk about is trying to do the grimoire stuff today, and this is the bulk of what I really wanted to talk to you about because you do it. I think a lot of people, when they look at the grimoire tradition stuff, they're really intimidated and scared because it all looks hard and confusing, and I think it can be done. So I think we should talk about the first question. Is it possible to actually do grimoire tradition in the modern day, or is it out of our reach?
Yes, it is, but at the same time, you're going to have. Okay, so yes, you can do some stuff, most things by the book. Um, However, a lot of it is prohibitively expensive. So, in a lot of grimoires, there's usually some point where it says, oh, you need to make X magical implement. Let's say it's a ring, right?
Yeah.
And that ring needs to be made out of a specific metal, right? Oftentimes, that metal is incredibly expensive because it's gold, and I believe gold at the time of this recording is vaguely 1800 an ounce, roughly.
Let's look it up. Value of gold. I'm guessing it's going to be a little down because the dollar is really strong right now. We're Americans. So the price per ounce is $1,744.
Okay, that's down. All right, I remember looking a while back and it was like almost 2000. But
Yeah, the economy is really weird recently because like the world currencies are dropping, but the dollar's doing well, but at the same time we're having inflation. It's very bizarre. I'm not an
it's
economist, so I can't really make sense of it. But I guess if you want to make your prohibitively expensive golden rings, it might be the time to do it. But yeah, it is difficult. And so when you're attempting it, I mean, I've met people who are very puristic about it, right? I've met people who are like, I'm going to do it perfectly by the book because I respect the tradition. I want the tradition to continue how it is meant to. And so they do everything perfectly. And then I've met people who basically have the opposite mentality. They like took that little section of the Abramelin where it says even a servant could attempt this and being like, okay, so I can change all the things and like basically make it work if I understand correspondence. How do you feel about these two worldviews?
so I want to, honestly, I'd love to know how the purists are doing their gold pentacles of sun for the greater key, because that sounds insane to me. I'd love to be able to make those, but again, prohibitively expensive. As for the people who are like, yeah, we don't need to do any structure. We can just, a servant can do it in his master's house. Yeah, let's go. You do need a little bit of structure, because one of the things about, one of the very bizarre things that kind of flips when you reach like more modern occultism is ceremonial magic and, grimoire tradition. And I'm kind of using them interchangeably because a lot of the ceremonial magic is based on the grimoires.
Well, it's
Was
interesting because the term grimoire tradition is sort of a nebulous category. Like we've defined it as Renaissance medieval, but the thing is, it can get kind of stretched because there are things that happen a little later that sort of have the spirit of it, and so I think we can use it a little loosely because no
it's
one really has cleanly defined it. Anyways, we're attempting, but it's somewhat of a shifting category. But I think the funny thing is, we say grimoire tradition, people like know what you're talking about, even if you don't have a specific definition for it, just because there was such a specific style and vibe.
it's basically just old magical textbooks pre the Black Brick. That's pre Regardi's Golden Dawn. That's basically it. Um, but yeah, the whole thing about it is there's a weird mentality shift of old school grimoire magic was primarily for physical gain and making money. There are, I would love to know if somebody has gone through and counted how many love and money spells are in the PGM. I'm betting almost half of them.
Oh yeah, I made really spicy take the other day where I said basically, while manifestation and getting stuff is valuable and has a place, I do it myself. The ultimate goal is, gnosis, all these things. And I stand by that take. But some people were like, "Oh, this is just you saying we should like return to the grimoire tradition." And I'm like, "No, people have been using magic just to get stuff for a very long time."
No, that's most of the grimoire tradition right there, just getting things.
No, it's been discourse for like forever. Like, should magic be used solely for ascension, blah blah blah, versus getting stuff? I say use it for both and don't neglect either side. I guess I'm a very moderate on this discussion, but a lot of the grimoire spells, I remember the first time I looked through them because I kind of was like, oh, these are like good boy Christian magic. I'm sure it's just about praying to God. They bind the demons because the demons are bad. I remember looking through them, and there's one it's in Crossed Keys, which is like Scarlet Imprints, like basically translation of like a bunch of small grimoires, like the Indicron. Um, I don't remember the rest of them in there, but one of them was basically a grimoire spell to get a girl to dance naked for you. And I remember looking at that, and I was like, I don't know. I think you might have to go to confession for that one, but you're using God to get it. And so it just kind of confused my brain. But it's the truth. People have been using this stuff for, personal gain for a very long time. And I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. But yeah, I mean, the funny thing about some of the money spells for me in the grimoires is I'm like, by the time you like finish this money spell, I feel like you already would have to make money to make all this stuff. And so it's like there's something funny about it to me at certain points.
I mean, in medieval times, you might have just had a bunch of beeswax and a chicken running around, but in modern day, in an apartment in the city, that would be extremely difficult to acquire, I think.
Oh,
And
I have a funny story about that. So I know a girl who, if you didn't know this, in the PGM, the incense to Hecate includes baboon shit.
yep,
And I heard a story, don't know if this is true, this is New York cult lore, that there was someone who tried to call the Bronx Zoo to buy baboon shit off of them to make the incense properly, and they did get rejected. But they tried.
I mean, you can try, but that doesn't mean you'll succeed. And then there's the whole angle of, well, if I failed and I didn't get all I need for the proper incense, maybe I'm not supposed to be doing this.
Well, I don't think that's true because I mean, even like let's look at the Western occult revival, which is the Victorian Edwardian period, right? That's with the Golden Dawn, that's with Crowley, that's with Theosophy, where all this stuff really kicked off and began the modern movement. I would say if you're looking at a big historic sense, we're kind of still in that period in a very weird way because that period was the beginning of today in a lot of senses. But if you even look at how they did these grimoires, they changed things. Like they did. And if you look at the Golden Dawn, which a lot of the Golden Dawn's principles come from this stuff, the Golden Dawn is stripped down in a lot of ways. The Golden Dawn is very ceremonial by modern standards, but it's not as extreme as a lot of this grimoire stuff was. I mean, the materials are weird, but they're much easier to make and much more doable than some of the older stuff.
I mean, a lot of the Golden Dawn tools you can make out of cardboard, wood, and a piece of pipe, really. Most of the old grimoires are like, make this ring on this day in this hour when the moon is in this sign, not aspecting this planet but aspecting this other planet, and then you'll get good results in your magic. The Golden Dawn is like, yeah, if it's good astrological timing, just pull out the fire wand, pull out the butt plug wand, and pull out the magical tools, and pull out the incense, and just do that. Do
For
your thing.
context on the term the butt plug wand, I highly suggest everyone Google Golden Dawn Fire Wand. You can thank me later. You'll get a good giggle out of it.
I do own the butt plug wand. I do own the Golden Dawn fire wand. It's yeah. I don't know what they were thinking.
I think
I,
it's beautiful.
it's really fun and ritual because like if you're in trance and you're in the right magical state, it's really powerful. But I don't think most old grimoires would have had you make a butt plug wand.
My big critique of the Golden Dawn is not their rituals, not their techniques, not their magic, just that I like think their aesthetic is bad. I think that they need to calm down with the primary color usage. That's my formal critique of it. But yeah, I mean, I think the lesson to learn from that is that there is value in putting in a lot of work and time into things. Like, I think the grimoires, I guess it's maybe because they had more time in the day back in the medieval vibes when you're living in your like medieval serf village or whatever it was they did back then. I don't know. But I think one thing to learn is that you can put a lot of care into this stuff. But I think the grimoires, I mean, I don't think you need to go as extreme as a lot of the grimoires have people do. I think sometimes they are a little, as we would say, overkill.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the old grimoires are definitely overkill, but if you think about it, they didn't really have, you know, people didn't really have online occult communities at that time when, there was the Renaissance. So not many people were talking about occultism at all. And if they were, it was like a student mentor relationship. And most of the time, the students and the mentors would be part of the church because the church, if you were a member of the clergy, could get more leniency. And then we go back to our good, wholesome Christian magic. But even then, a lot of the really strictness of the grimoire traditions, if you go through and read some of the books, it will explain how you can do like not a stripped down version, but like a lesser version of it, which is actually more convenient in modern day.
Oh, yeah, definitely pay attention to the little sort of, I don't know, cheat codes in them. Can I call them cheat codes?
They're cheat
They make
codes.
it a lot more like manageable. Also, there are like ways to make it a little easier. Like with your floor circles, you can just make like little mats. Or I know that the cheap way to do it is to open a Redbubble account as an artist and then like screenshot the circle you want and just submit it as design and buy it from yourself. That's the way to do it. Then you have a permanent mat. That's my big life tip for y'all.
Life hack: start a Redbubble account and sell to yourself.
Yeah, no, it works. It's actually like a decent idea. I stand by this. I don't remember who said this to me. So whoever you are, if you're the one who told me this, credit to you. I don't remember who you are, but that was
I'm
very
gonna
smart.
I'm gonna do that now. I need new circle mats.
You
Uh,
should do it.
I
But yeah,
should.
there are ways to like make it work. I'm in the camp where adaptation has some value so that you can actually do things because obviously it's better in my brain to, strip something down a little bit than to not do it at all, right?
Yep.
But I think you still need to try. Like I think sometimes the just change it can go a little too far and go into, well, now you're just doing a different thing, which is fine. You can totally do a different thing and be inspired by something older. But after a certain point, I think it kind of loses its, connection to source. So I say adapt up to a point is kind of where I stand on the topic.
Right, and for certain grimoires, that's certainly necessary, and for certain spells in different grimoires, that's definitely required because if I wanted to just crack open the PGM to a random page, an unfortunate amount of times I'm going to find an animal sacrifice spell on one of those pages. And
Oh yeah. There's also like with PGM in particular, I've seen people taking invocation and stuff like basically what they'll do is they'll take components of older rituals and then throw it into new formworks or new frameworks, which I think is probably the best if you're gonna try to strip it down super like take it really extreme. I feel like at that point you may as well just like extract part of it and throw it into something else instead of being like I'm just gonna do this super stripped down. But that's up to you. Um, my next sort of thing I wanted to tap into is why do you think and how do you think magical style has changed? Because obviously we went from let's sacrifice cattle and be good church clergy members to people filming themselves, doing weird things with lemons. So, how do you think that happened?
I'm going to put a little bit of a disclaimer that for most of my magical career and most of my magical practice, I have been doing the equivalent of living in a bunker. So I am not necessarily the most familiar with the lemon hexing that's been going on.
Probably for the best. Stay pious.
I'm not even pious, but just, trying to stay away from whatever that is in the corner over there. But if you look at it, it definitely looks like the reason is actually because we're not really reading the grimoires. Um, because grimoires do have a reputation to them that it's if you're more pagan leaning, you don't really do grimoire stuff because it's all very Christian, even though a lot of the hermetic Christians is like paganism adjacent. So that again, Agrippa, um, the Arbitel, Book of Oberon, that sort of thing. Those are all paganism adjacent, I'd say.
Oh, I would say so too. I mean, I remember I looked at the Arbitel. I was working with the Arbitel actually very recently. It's the Grimoire that I've worked with the most recently. And the hardest part, I will say this, is the waking up at dawn part. I can adapt everything else to the modern day. Waking up at dawn, that's a struggle for me. But the way that it works is really interesting because basically it argues that these pagan spirits exist in a sense. They're just underneath the Christian God, which I find is a pretty interesting theory on how things work. And so you see like these sort of alternative cosmologies coming in, so where it's like Christian, but you can tell they're kind of stretching the definition of Christian a little bit to the point where those little evangelical Protestants would like lose their brain, you know? So some of these Christian grimoires kind of stretch Christian a little bit to the point where it's like iffily Christian or iffily not Christian.
Yeah, definitely. Because most of the pagan Christianity, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it actually comes from one of the lines in Exodus, I believe, where one of the commandments is, Thou shalt not have gods before me, which means you can work with other gods, but they can't be your primary god. Big G god, which eventually gets syncretized with the Hermetic All in more modern occult places, I think, ends up being the primary god, and then you can go work with Dionysus and Horus and all the other gods like Odin, Thor. You can go work with them and still be technically Christian, which is kind of what these grimoires were doing in their very bizarre cosmologies, because a lot of the grimoires have, if you look at their cosmologies and their like hierarchies of the spirits, they're kind of all just giving you a hot take. Here's how the world is set up, and
Oh,
then they get into it.
oh, they totally are. Like the beginning of the Arbital is basically these like points, these little principles, and it throws an entire alternative cosmology at you. It's like, yes, we are Christians, but and it gets really interesting. And there are some strains of Christianity today that still kind of have this pagan Christianity quality to them. Um, you see it with the old believers in Russia, and you see it in Latin America and various places where you have this kind of very syncretic thing going on. So it's still a thing that people do. It's just a little less popular. Though I don't know if the grimoires ever would be described as popular. I may be reaching with that one. But my theory on how it's shifted is I think when the Golden Dawn and the Victorian revival happened, they like kind of they went in a slightly different direction. They used more accessible materials. They made things a little bit more accessible, and then I think out of that it just kind of continued in that pattern, right? Of people being like, I'm going to make this more, in line with my current situation in my life, and that just continued. And obviously, I mean, theosophy was the big turning point of people, going from Western esotericism to New Age with New Thought and all that, which is where we get all the strange stuff going on. Thanks, Blavatsky.
Thanks.
Thanks. I don't know whether to thank her or not thank her. I feel a lot of mixed feelings towards Miss Helena.
Blavatsky's very conflicting.
Yeah, I think there's no other opinion to have on her besides depends on the day and what she's talking about.
Well, most of the stuff modern occultists would do would be considered black magic by her anyways, so...
Oh, that's true.
Thanks.
I mean, this idea of this like moralism of black and white magic, or whatever else you want to call it, if you're someone who has a problem with those terms, blah 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 blah, disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. That concept has existed for a long time, and even Crowley, who is seen as the arbiter of evil by mainstream culture, kind of had that perspective too. So,
I
just
mean,
throwing
even
that.
Crowley thought that there were certain things you shouldn't do, right? And then Jack Parsons was like, I'm gonna do that thing. And then Crowley was like, you are evil. Get out of here.
Oh, Crowley was like people think Crowley was a lot edgier and darker than he was. I feel like the media making him a cultural legend has really built him up in this way that's not true. Like what's funny is the average like left-hand path blogger is way edgier than Crowley ever was. Because Crowley had this idea of like the Black Brothers and thought magic should be used for gnosis and true will and all these things. Like Crowley was kind of almost uptight by what people do now. I think a lot of people would probably sympathize more with Parsons than Crowley these days.
I mean, Parsons kind of... My hot take on this entire thing is that Parsons started modern Thelema and, like, the modern Thelemic attitude. It wasn't Crowley, it was Parsons.
I think that there's a community of Thelemites that could just be called Parsonites. In my book, I write about this. My book that will eventually happen. So help me God, I will make it happen.
Eventually.
It's happening. It's gonna happen. I'm working on it.
Just call it a grimoire. It'll happen
I
400
believe.
years later.
No, it will not be that long. I'll self-publish on Amazon before it gets to that point. My next point is, what do you think modern occultists can learn from these traditions? Because I think there is some wisdom in them that's sort of been lost as things have. This is the thing. Things have modernized and become accessible, but while they've done that, they've diluted. And so I think that's sort of a double-edged sword of like, how do we balance that? But beyond that, what lessons do you think modern occultists should learn? Because I think there are some things that we could take from the grimoires that we would really appreciate.
Okay. Going back to the grimoires is like going back to the basics of occultism that you never actually learned. If you go through the grimoires, you can learn a bunch of magical techniques that can improve your practice just by going back and reading one of the books. If you go back and read, say, the Arbitel or the Lesser Key and the Greater Key, you can learn things in there just based on how they were working their magic and their structure that you will not find a replacement for in modern books. There is an entire section on how to replace your metal pentacle implements with paper in the Greater Key. Now, I don't recommend you do that because it takes like 2 weeks, 3 weeks to prep all the things. It's insane. But if you take what you learn there of just break down what they're doing, figure out why they're doing it, you can use that to improve your practice. And if you were the kind of person who wants to make, say, sigil magic, and you want to do sigil magic, go figure out how to do the consecration rituals of the papers from the Greater Key, combine that with your sigil magic, boom, you've just synthesized 2 magical arts together, and you've probably just improved your success rate with sigil magic.
Oh yeah, that's in my opinion one of the greatest values of the grimoires because I do tell people to read them in all my book recommendation videos. I always throw at least one in because I think while they're difficult, they have the foundations of modern occultism. Because let's be real, Western occultism is an evolving tradition that began and grew and became what it is today. Right? It's a living tradition. I think we are all hacking into a current that has existed since the beginning of Western civilization. So, I think because of that, we should know where it comes from and look at what's there because what's there did lead to what happened now. Obviously, they look really different in the moment, right? Like a sigil and the Pentacles of Solomon do not look similar,
No.
right? I mean, I guess they're both symbols, so I guess that's the thing. But the funny thing is, those pentacles, without those, we probably wouldn't have modern sigils, and so you can learn a lot from them. And as well, you can, if you want to get all chaos magic about it, you can copy paste things. You can take things from these grimoires and put it into a modern ritual format, and it work really well.
And just because we're talking about sigils, sigils are in Agrippa. Sigils originated from Agrippa and got kind of developed more by Austin Osman Spare and the Chaos Magicians. They're in Agrippa already. They're already in the Grimoires. That's why you should take a look.
Oh yeah, I always when people talk about chaos magic, I always source it to AO Spare typically, and I've gotten so many people nitpicking that, being like, "Well, chaos magic began with the '70s," and I'm like, "Well, all the fucking chaos magic techniques began with stuff Austin Osman Spare was doing, and what did the stuff that Austin Osman Spare was doing begin from? That would be Typhonian Thelema. He's close with Grant, Kenneth
Yep.
Grant, and that whole crazy system, which Typhonian Thelema is a whole can of worms. I'll get into Cthulhu Thelema one day, I promise. And then that came from Crowley, and that came from Mathers, and that came from the Golden Dawn, and that came from that, and that, and then that. And it traces back. And so all these things began with what's ahead of it. And I think to learn about any form of occultism, you need to learn what came. I don't think you need necessarily learn the entire tradition from start to finish because that's a huge monumental task. But I think you need to learn what came right ahead of it. So I tell everyone getting into chaos magic, Austin Osman Spare is really important because he was the person who looked at Crowley's rituals and said, let's strip it down further, right? And that's how we get the stuff we have today. And so with me as a thelemite, what am I going to look at? The Golden Dawn. If you're a Golden Dawner, what should you look at? What happened right before that? And I think that it becomes a nice little sort of game because all this stuff came from something before it because most of the time we are experiencing similar experiences even though we're living in radically different time periods, right? While our culture has changed, our time has changed, our station, society has changed, this magic really hasn't, right? The magic still works, even though it's old fashioned or ancient. I mean, it still works, right? It's still a living tradition, even if it's from the past.
Right. And you can really reconstruct some things from the past. You might take a couple books, like going through and looking at the Lesser Key for a moment. There's a part in the Ars Paulina where it says, oh, you need to have these discs, and it gives you very archaic measurements for how to make them. And if you tally up the price ranges from anywhere from like a couple bucks to over 2K. Now, you could do that, or you could go look at what the Golden Dawn did and figure out how they started summoning stuff, because if they're basing their works off of older traditions, those newer traditions might help you tap into things from older traditions.
What do you think the biggest misconception about the grimoire tradition that modern occultists have is?
That you should start with Goetia.
Ooh, spill the tea on Goetia because when we talk
Okay.
about grimoires, it's actually my most viewed video on YouTube.
Okay.
Everyone wants to hear about the Goetia, but there are more. It is not just Goetia.
Okay.
Goetia is not everything.
At some point, this video will go up on my channel, and it will be about the Lesser Key of Solomon. But here's the rub with the Lesser Key of Solomon. There's 4 books in the Lesser Key of Solomon, possibly 5 if you include the Notoria. I'm going to ignore the Notoria existing because I'm waiting until Stephen Skinner gets his version out with the actual notary of the Notoria. There's the Goetia, the Third Year Goetia, the Ars Pauline, and the Ars Almadel. Of these, the Ars Goetia is the one everyone remembers, and usually this will be taken off and it will be thrown into its own book There was a really nice Goetia version. I think it's the Lemegeton of Crowley, where there's really cool art for all of the demons.
Oh yeah, Crowley's version is the one that sells the most. You see it in a lot of occult stores here in the city. It's in like all of them. It is my favorite version because one, I'm a simp for Crowley, but also it's laid out really cleanly and nicely.
I loved the art in that book. However, it also goes into the problem of, think about it like this. They had to explain every single spirit to you in detail and give warnings, and some of those warnings are very vague, right?
Yeah.
And you really can't. Where are you going to get a Pope hat, or a mitre, as it's called? Where are you going to get the lion skin belt? Where are you going to get all these materials for it? You could start with that, or you could go to the back of the book, ignore the existence of the Almadale, because that is a hot garbage mess of a book. Go to the Ars Pauline and call up your natal angel using other methods, right?
Yeah.
Because if you want to do grimoire tradition stuff well and properly, you're going to need to, at some point, synthesize it with other materials. My favorite ones is one of the things that I've picked up, and I don't remember where I picked it up. It's one of those things where, if you're an occultist for a while, what'll happen is you'll pick up knowledge and you'll pick up some bits and pieces of like, oh, here's how this particular system works. And then you will not remember where you got it from, and you'll just keep using it. And then people will ask you where you got it from, and you'll be like, that's a good question. I don't remember. All angels can call up other angels. In the Diaries of John Dee, John Dee was allegedly given a method of calling up the Archangel Michael. What you can do, just call up the Archangel Michael. He's in most of the angel grimoires. Just have Michael send the right angels to you. It's not that hard.
Everything comes back to Archangel Michael. Literally every single thing.
If it doesn't come back to Michael, it comes back to like Metatron.
Yeah, I would agree. So, my final little thing I want to talk about is what advice would you have for your average normie modern person who wants to get into the grimoires? How did you do it? What's your advice?
Read a book. Just go read a book. That's what grimoires are. They're just fancy magical textbooks. More serious answer, go find something that you personally vibe with and that really speaks to you. Just read it and know that you're not going to cast and do every spell from every grimoire. The PGM is one of the most famous grimoires of all time. Not everyone does every spell in that, and if they do, I am so sorry for all of the animals and their wallet, because I once got in trouble on Twitter because I made a joke that said, my practice consists of every animal sacrifice ritual in the PGM, including the joke ones. Because,
Oh no! I'm assuming people got mad. Did like PETA come into your DMs?
no, somebody asked me what the joke ones were, and I'm like, well, you shouldn't be doing them in the first place.
This for legal reasons.
I
And
do
for
not
YouTube
condone
terms of
animal
service,
sacrifice.
yeah, for YouTube terms of service reasons, we do not condone sacrificing things.
I do not condone animal sacrifice. I do not do animal
I
sacrifice.
don't do it either, though the Supreme Court did rule that it is legal in the United States.
Finally. No, still not going to do it. But that's another thing. Grimoires often have blinds, which I don't think we covered.
We need to. We should talk about that because no one ever talks about it. Just
Okay.
explain them very briefly, please, because the audience needs to know.
So, blinds are misinformation put in a book for the purpose of having a magical instructor or teach you correct them. This actually, we've talked about Agrippa so much already, might as well throw him under the bus. A lot of Agrippa's Hebrew is wrong. If you talk to Jewish Kabbalists, they will tell you that Agrippa's Hebrew is just wrong. It is not what, because Agrippa was in that weird transitionary period where they weren't using Jewish Kabbalah, they were like starting to translate it into Christian Kabbalah with a C instead of a K. because he was in that transitionary period, a lot of his Hebrew is either incorrect, or it seems like what most likely happened is the people who were teaching him just taught him misinformation. He wrote it down, and now we have misinformation in the modern day. But thankfully, with the advent of the internet, we know that it's wrong information. The theory is still sound, but the actual mechanics behind it are incorrect.
Counterpoint: can we use the the cheating method of bad Hebrew, where we say technically we don't know how ancient Hebrew was spoken, so technically you can't say anything is wrong? Can we use that excuse?
I wish we could, but some of it is like actually just the word is completely wrong.
Damn it! No, I love
Yeah.
that excuse. It's very useful.
We also just don't know how he used some of his tables. Like, some of his tables are just completely out there.
I find that a lot of these tables in these older books, and I'm going to lump in Crowley 777 with this, even though I love that book. There's like a learning curve to learning to read the tables, where it's almost like sometimes you could have learned why the things correspond without looking at the table quicker than takes you to understand the tables.
My favorite thing is there is a bizarre thing that occurs in old grimoires that seems to have happened in the Golden Dawn too, where there was like a there was like a babyfying version, or like a let's tone down how brutally ruthless Mars is, between the Golden Dawn and like earlier sources, because in earlier sources it's like, yeah, Mars is just like the planetary spirit of heavy metal albums, dragons, blood, murder, and violence. And then it's like, ah, yes, modern day, it's like Mars is just gym bros.
And I think that's where we get this, like, I don't know if you've heard this dog shit take that Mars is toxic masculinity.
Okay, that's a terrible take, because the whole point of Mars. So there's two versions of every planet.
Yeah,
When people think toxic masculinity, they're not even thinking of Mars. They're thinking of Mercury, right?
yeah.
Mars is the, like, pure good Mars is the kind of thing where if you're getting robbed, they're the planetary, or the guy who runs up and punches the person who's robbing you to the ground and then like restrains them while the cops are coming,
Yeah.
right? The whole concept of, oh yeah, Mars is toxic masculinity. It's like, no, you want Mars because Mars is like, being able to move and all that. But Mars has also got, anyone who is horny on main needs to go read about what Mars is, because Mars is always horny on main. So is Venus, but Mars too. Mostly Mars.
With that, I say we get into our final thoughts. What is your sort of closing message?
Um, Read more grimoires. Please use less lemons. Just go through, read some grimoires, and like advance your practice. Because the thing about it is, you can read modern books, and modern books are good. But if you read old grimoires, 9 times out of 10, you're actually reading like 3 books that have been like sewn together in a sewing machine. So you're getting more value by reading more book from more author, if you think about it like that.
I think that's a great way to think about it, because the thing is with these older books is that they're very different. I'm not trying to shade modern occult authors. I'm a modern occult person, so I don't know. I guess I'm shading myself a little bit with this too. I think that we've, sometimes watered down what we discuss and focused so much on beginner stuff that we never go deeper, which I myself have been guilty of. But the grimoires reject that mentality entirely and just throw you into the deep end with no life vest and say, figure it out.
Yep, they definitely do. And remember, the grimoire tradition mentality is, you are a good, wholesome Christian boy or girl. So what you should be doing is asking God for money, because God doesn't want you to be poor.
That's the message that I took away when I read the Bible, to be completely honest.
Yep, that part about something something rich man through the eye of a needle. Yeah,
Fake news. Fake
Fake
news.
news. Jesus never said that.
Jesus wants you to get rich.
It was actually a demon who was screaming that at the top of his lungs. So that's what people heard over Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus says, fuck bitches, get money, use the grimoires. So, with that, that has been our show. Dave, where can we find you?
You can find me at Amateur Magus on YouTube and all the links in the description down below. I got stuff coming, probably. Hopefully, I'm not going to take 6 months to do it like last time. I'm going to try to get more content out the rest of this year. I'm going to try to get 2 mini books done by November. So hopefully that happens. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, you should check Dave out. Dave has some really useful videos, and Dave's been a friend of mine for a long time. He knows his stuff, so check him out. I'm Georgina Rose. I am Dot Darling. You can find me many a places. I am on YouTube. I do this podcast, obviously. I would assume you know I do a podcast if you're listening to this, or I don't know how you got here. I'm also on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. I am also on Telegram if you're someone who does not like mainstream social. As well, I re-upload most of my stuff to Odyssey if you're someone who prefers that. And Patreon's the way to support me. If you join the Patreon of this show, you get this thing called the pre-show, which is really cool. You get all your stuff early, and you know you get you get this thing called the pre-show, which is basically a like 10-minute mini podcast that I do. You get you know, full versions of this, a lot of other things. It's really cool. You should check it out. And if you want to support me individually, I have a Patreon for other things that I do where I give even other things. So thank you for listening. And wait, one final thing. We cannot close out yet. If you are of a patron tier that gets a shout out, here is your shout out. Though if you want to be anonymous, you can opt out by messaging me. But thank you to Emerson, James, Emil, Neva, Lilith, Marcelo, Jonah, Nauseated, and Lee. You have enabled me and continued to allow me to make this podcast. So thank you for your continued support. This has been the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that desecrates and breaks down the false idols and icons of the postmodern age in order to live an authentic, esoteric spirituality. Have a nice day, afternoon, mid morning, late morning, whatever time it is, wherever you are. All right, bye.